Let's rock this popsicle stand.
25 cents. All right, we'll do the freeze frame thing until we know.
Welcome everybody to Live Q&A. I am Pastor Dave, and with me is Recovering Heretic Dan. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. Emphasis on recovering. Hi Dan.
Hi Dave. And today, we're just going to, since it is Epiphany, we still...
Last day of Christmas.
Sneaking it in.
Yeah. Technically, Epiphany is tomorrow for any...
Yeah, January 6th.
Liturgical Nazi out there, you know. Technically, it's tomorrow, and today is the 12th day of Christmas, so...
Oh. So we get all the big gifts today.
Yeah, right.
From our true love.
Yes.
Yeah, so I wanted to wrap up. We had a lot of Christmas questions people had that we couldn't get to last time.
Right.
So we're going to wrap them up today. But before that, a quick thing, it hit me when we were doing the reading from John today.
Luke, you mean?
Luke, sorry.
Yeah.
With the whole, Jesus grew wise and divine. That line stuck out to me. So it kind of implies that it wasn't like fully incarnated.
Grew in divine favor, right?
Yeah. So, was there... I'd read that some people early in church debated about, saying that the apostles felt that he became divine through the course of his life, and he wasn't born that way. And that's what rang when I heard that was. So did he grow, or was he? Because the popular conception is that he was just like all that right from the moment of birth.
Yeah. Right.
But this implies no, he had some maturing to do.
Well,
I didn't say this would be easy. So
part of what's going on there is Luke's making an allusion back to the Old Testament, where the stories of Samuel and Moses both have that exact same line tagged on as the stories of their infants, right? And the child grew
and became wise
and in divine favor, right? So part of what's going on is, most of what's going on is Luke's making he's stealing from the Old Testament. He's making a reference that if you grew up in Sunday school, you would have heard at that point, right?
Okay.
It would have cued you to what kind of life Jesus was in for, with that phrase, right?
Okay. So that phrase is also including the downs.
This is a prophet's life with all that a prophet's life entails coming up, especially also since Luke 1 and 2 is written in a deliberately old for its day version of Greek. It's kind of like if I wrote something in King James English, it's written in the Greek of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But that was like a couple hundred years old at that point.
Yeah.
And so it's about the equivalent of me writing something in King James English. You'd understand I was deliberately trying to be fancy biblical.
Yeah.
And Luke wrote just chapters 1 and 2 in that style. And so...
But the rest of it he wrote in the more modern...
The rest of it is in modern, for his day, Greek. And so, as that's the line that kind of chapter 2 ends on, right? It's basically, okay, here endeth the warm-up to the prophet. We are at the prophet now,
So in a way, the first two chapters for Luke are forewords. They're introductions.
Yeah, they're introductions to...
the story.
Right. It's like, okay, now this part is wrapped up.
Okay.
And I've ended on this line that the infancy narratives of Moses and Samuel and a couple other prophets have all ended on, in this same way.
Well, given that, do we know that it's the same author?
We're pretty sure. He uses the same vocabulary and has the same themes. It's just, he deliberately tried to write the Christmas story, and he succeeded. It's the one we still read, to this day, right? So, congrats, Luke. You achieved what you wanted to do.
Yeah. So his was like the Christmas Carol of the time. It's the popular one we took up on.
Right.
Okay.
So that's a lot of what As to whether Jesus needed to, in some ways he obviously needed to grow, right? He needed to learn to walk and talk. I doubt he was born fully articulate, fully ambulatory. He needed to go through that same maturing process. He needed to go through puberty, all that kind of stuff. I don't think that means his godhood grew, Yeah. That's not what happened.
Okay.
That's not what he's trying to say.
Gotcha. All right, so we'll take off then where we left off. And this is kind of good because we're still talking then about early on. And we left off, we had just started talking about the slaughter of the infants, the massacre of the innocents.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm wondering in that one, we'd mentioned before about how so much of the story takes place in these small, nondescript places, and that may be why we have no historical records.
Yeah.
But again, there's no historical record of this incident, and what makes it stand out to me is it's not just that it's not in the general historical record, but it's not in Josephus, who was obsessed with this Herod, and it's not in Luke either. So if it is that important, and if it did really happen, why do Josephus and Luke not talk about it at all? Or is this another one that's supposed to be a metaphor or drawing from an earlier text?
I don't think I think it illustrates a theology point, right? Which is Jesus is born into a world of violence. I guess I would say I'm not sure this would have even registered in the headlines, given how bloody Herod was. He had
normalized that kind of violence.
Yeah, we're not talking. Bethlehem's a very tiny. We're not talking thousands of kids here. I mean, killing any kid is bad, right? But we're probably talking under a dozen. So I'm not sure that would have registered in the headlines.
Because it's a small village to begin with.
It's a small village. Herod had, this is the guy who executes members of his own family left and right. There's a joke. The Romans used to tell this joke. Augustus used to love this joke, Caesar Augustus, and it was better to be a pig in Herod's household than a child. And the point was that he was Jewish, so he wouldn't kill a pig, but he would kill one of his own kids, because he did have one of his own kids, several of his own kids executed. So I'm not sure Josephus would have even registered on Josephus's scale of Herod's crimes, as awful as it is, right? But it's a bunch of backward peasants in the middle of nowhere, nobody would have noticed, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of Scripture, that Scripture notices the people that, historians don't, right? As to why Luke doesn't record it because Luke's not. Herod's not actually in Luke's narrative at all. It's Caesar, Augustus, and Quirinius, but Herod's not in the narrative until Jesus gets to be an adult, and it's one of Herod's kids. So Herod the Great's not even a part of Luke's schema of things. He's not really who God is responding to in the world at that point.
Yeah, I never noticed that. So Herod doesn't even show up in the Passion period.
He does. That Herod shows up, but that's not Herod the Great, right?
That's right.
Herod the Great doesn't feature in Luke's narrative at all. You get obviously Herod's kids and grandkids that
the ones he didn't kill.
The ones he didn't kill do get featured, right? When Jesus has a couple confrontations with Herod the Great's kids, but the Herod the Great we meet in Matthew 1 and 2 doesn't feature at all in Luke's narrative. He doesn't even get named in that list of, people that, right?
That's interesting in itself.
Yeah.
It is remarkable. The more we talk, the more I realize how much each writer just saw totally different things as important.
Yeah, they each have an agenda, right? Like this is where modern history and ancient biography are two very different genres, because like we tend to think of bad history as history with agendas, and they didn't think that was a problem at all, and so like they each have a clear agenda in their writing, so Luke is much more concerned with kind of temple establishment and then an imperial propaganda, like whereas Matthew's far more concerned with Jesus as King of Israel, and so in that regard, Herod features a much more prominent place in Matthew's gospel, especially at its beginning than in Luke's, where Luke's far more concerned about Augustus and Quirinius and, peace on earth, which is this direct jab at imperial propaganda, and like Luke's just got a different vision of scope than Matthew does.
I didn't realize that before too. So the whole peace on earth thing is actually a jab at the Pax Romana.
Yeah, it's actually right. I mean, it's a direct jab at imperial propaganda, just written in such a way that it passed the censor's muster, so.
Yeah, we totally forget that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And just since you mentioned the agenda, broadly, what's the difference between Matthew and Luke's agenda that they include the nativity story versus John and Peter that they don't bother with that at all?
Or
John and Mark.
John and Mark,
yeah.
right.
I have Mark and Peter just tightly associated.
Right, and they are. Mark's agenda is Jesus is the crucified one. So towards that end.
So it's just the end of the story that really matters.
Yeah. Mark's crucifixion narrative takes up the exact same number of chapters as it does in the other Gospels, even though his is about half the length of the other Gospels. And so like, percentage-wise, the crucifixion is a much bigger part of Mark's gospel than it is all the other ones.
It's so important.
Yeah. So Mark doesn't care about anything that doesn't get you
to the crucifixion.
To the crucifixion. It's just, he barely cares about the resurrection, much less infancy narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because in the original, doesn't
our oldest
Mark actually end right at that, and they came to the tomb and it was empty. The end.
Well, right, and the angel says, he went on to meet you at Galilee, just like he said, and the women ran away from the tomb, for they were terrified and afraid, Right. Jesus is the crucified one.
It's all that matters.
Right, it's all that matters.
So with John, why does he not see it as important? Is the eternity of Jesus what's more important to him?
Yeah, John's far more interested in Jesus is the one from heaven who comes down from heaven and returns to heaven, right? Like there's this down from heaven back up to heaven cycle that Jesus is engaged in. And so what you get out of John is the prologue about the Word, right? And so Jesus is the pre-existing logos, rational principle of the universe, the Word, and he is this pre-existent thing. And so the infancy would just kind of distract from that, when what he really wants you to get at is he is the one who was with the Father
at the beginning,
from before the beginning, and then descends from the Father to us to return to the Father, So, yeah.
Yeah. So it's his eternity that's really
important. His, right.
This is just an interlude, so the beginning of it isn't really...
Right. Well, it does, right, the beginning itself doesn't particularly, other than that it happened, and so he does have that line about, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but that's really all you need to know for John, is that pre-existing eternal thing became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen him, and that's John's agenda is looking at Jesus is looking at God, and so like we have seen the Word became flesh, and therefore we have seen what God is like,
And now that you've seen it, that's all that's important.
Right, that's all that's important. I mean, the other thing is Mary's just not a huge character in John. Like Mary doesn't even get named in John's gospel. She's just not a huge character.
Oh, that's right.
Right,
It's just the woman.
right, the woman or Jesus' mother, right? Like she doesn't even get named, and so she's just not a huge character for John.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense. If you're not concerned about the nativity,
Right.
it wouldn't be. This gets into a cultural question. Given the practices of that era,
Yeah.
why did the Ben Yosef's family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph,
Yeah.
why did they stay in Bethlehem so long? In Matthew, it's up to 2 years.
Yeah.
And culturally, they should have dashed right back to
Dodge.
Nazareth.
Right. Well, right. Hard to know. Hard to know what they were doing there, other than they were doing there. And then also in Matthew's gospel, right, he heads down to Egypt before he
Comes back.
back, right? So like, hard to know. Extended stay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it's kind of weird. I like that you said extended stay, like an extended stay hotel. Because we get this big emphasis that there was no place for them.
No place for them, right?
So they hang out 2 years in the manger?
What I would suspect is they're depicted as a poor family, right? So like, moving's actually really hard if you're poor. Like it's not easy.
You can't hire porters or...
Right. And so what I suspect is they got there and they got stuck there, like many migrant families do, when they arrive in a place. So
It took a while to build back up.
yes.
Which then gets back to the whole question of then, because we sang about the 3 kings today, right?
Yeah,
Epiphany.
right.
So if they had all these gifts, I can't get over that contradiction.
Maybe he lost it in a Ponzi scheme, right? Like I don't, right? Like who knows, right? Again, they were refugees at one point, right? So maybe they had to leave it, right?
Yeah.
Like get out of Dodge, right? Or he had to spend it all on getting out of Dodge to Egypt and
To bribe authorities.
right?
Yeah.
I mean all that kind of stuff.
Some things never change. Like migrants face that today.
Right.
On the biblical anomalies, let's see, we talked about this last week, that Matthew and Luke give 2 different genealogies.
Yeah.
Why is the Annunciation to Joseph in Matthew, but in Luke, Mary gets the Annunciation?
Other than Matthew is interested in tracing Jesus's lineage through Joseph, so Joseph gets the message. It's
So it's again which side they want to trace the lineage on.
Right.
So why now do we only celebrate Mary's version? Mary gets all the attention. She even has her own special Annunciation
She does
day.
have her own special. Well, because that's actually that is the more important one, right? Joseph's message is don't screw this up. Don't divorce her. But Mary actually has an opportunity to say no, and she doesn't take it. Which is
So she could have put the kibosh on the whole plan. if
yeah,
she
she could have said, I don't want anything to do with this, and the church fathers make this comparison a lot, that Mary is undoing what Eve did in the garden when she says, let it be with me according to your will. She says, okay, God, sure. And whereas Eve said no, Mary says yes. And so there's this beginning to undo this problem of sin working in the world, which happens through Mary's yes. I will do this.
Okay. I can see that.
Which
Philosophically and theologically.
Philosophically and theologically is a much bigger deal than Joseph's. Don't divorce her.
We got this plan, don't screw it up.
Right.
Versus don't let us not even start the plan.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And So her saying yes to God is a big deal.
Okay.
Yes, I will do this.
And again, on the discrepancies in the two, how come Bethlehem is at two different stages? So it's not just like in Matthew where they stay for 2 years.
Uh-huh.
It's also whether or not they're even there. Like in Matthew, they're already there in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And in Luke, they make up the whole big thing about the census and having to travel, blah, 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 blah.
That one I don't know. I mean, could be that Matthew's just relating a different point, within that time scale.
So Matthew's like, previously on the
Right.
gospel.
Yeah, right. There's all sorts of historical problems with the census anyway, so maybe Luke's just mistaken, about his facts.
Yeah.
Or maybe we're mistaken about our fact, I mean.
Well, didn't you say Luke based a lot on interviews? So
Right.
It's possible like Game of Telephone.
People
he interviewed had
right.
it wrong.
Right, he has sources, so a source is wrong, that could happen. Or, again, I do want to emphasize this. It could be that he's right and we're wrong, I mean, he's actually much closer to the event than we are.
Yeah.
So, like, I know we say 2,000 years later, oh, we have no evidence for this, and that's true, but, like, Rome was burned to the ground a couple times, so, like, maybe we don't have complete census records.
Lost a scroll or two.
Right, we should perhaps give them a bit more credit. Just because we don't have any certain knowledge of a thing doesn't mean it didn't necessarily happen, right? Because, again, like, Luke's actually much closer to the event than we are.
Yeah. I'll give you grace on that one.
Yeah, and again, I'm not saying you have to, like, take it all at, like, yes, it's absolutely true, but, like, in our skepticism, we might want to we should remember that rational skepticism as a principle applies to our own knowledge as well as to Luke's knowledge, which is a part of what we sometimes forget.
It's easy to forget that. We've got time for just one more question, which is good because we have one question that's a carryover from last year.
Okay.
That we started to ask and ran out of time, so we never really finished it. And that is, why does Mary's memory of Jesus' divinity go away when she finally turns 15, after she's had Jesus?
Yeah.
Until Luke interviews her.
I don't know that it goes away.
Because her and Joseph's actions are as if they completely forgot about all this.
Yeah, I don't think it goes away. I think everybody has a vision of, I would say she probably had an expectation for what the Messiah was.
So just like everybody else, she had a prejudice about what the Messiah was going to be.
Right. She had a very preformed idea probably about what Messiahship looked like, and
here her kid is not living up to that.
Right. This is not right what I thought this would be, and
he's not showing a natural talent to be a warrior.
Or he is a great teacher, but he teaches contra, it seems like, what the actual words on the page say, and some people thought the Messiah would be a great warrior. Others thought he would be a great priest. Well, he doesn't get along with the priests, Some people thought the Messiah would be a great teacher, okay, but
he's also not a formal teacher.
Well,
he's
right. He's called.
What do they call them?
Rabbi. Well, rabbi.
No, but like a street rabbi, itinerant preacher.
Yeah, itinerant preacher, right. I mean, he's clearly had some rabbinic training, right? He can read, he knows scripture really well. He's given opportunities to preach, like, in synagogues, so, like, he's clearly had some training, like, but his whole first sermon, in Luke, he spends the whole time talking about how God blessed the Gentiles more than he blessed Israel, which gets everybody so riled up they're ready to kill him. And then in Matthew, his first sermon is the Sermon on the Mount, and it's the entire time he's going, well, you've read this, but I tell you,
this is what it means.
This is, well, not only this is what it means, but this is actually completely opposite sometimes of what,
what you read.
Of what you read,
Yeah.
right? Like, you read eye for an eye, you know, but I say to you, love your enemies, you know, like, now I think there's a logical principle there that is the through line through both those things. But, you know, if you're just listening to him, basically what he's saying is like, I know scripture says this, but actually this is more important, you know, like, or what I'm teaching you is actually correct, you know? And so if you add all that evidence up, you can get to where Mary probably gets when he's an adult and in his ministry. It's like, oh, he's just crazy, you know, like, come inside and we'll put you in the padded room, you know, kind of thing, right? Like, so I get how she got there, I guess.
I can see that. So the bottom line is, too, you know, he's so mismatched everybody's preconceptions.
Yeah.
You know, I can get, is that then, and we'll wrap up on this, is that why, a major part of why he says it is so difficult if you really want to follow him, because you are going against all these preconceptions, all these cultural norms.
Yeah, I
to
mean,
really do that.
Yeah, it's hard first because I think he really does mean you have to die. You know, like part of you dies doing this. You know, so like that's involved in it. But yeah, I mean, I think it involves renouncing everything humans kind of think about when we think about the word glory. You know, and it involves not only renouncing that, but also saying, actually, everything you think is glorious is actually bad. You know, like that pursuit and that love of glory is that love of triumphal marches and yada, yada, yada is actually not good, you know, and that's pretty hard to tell people, you know.
Yeah, even today, you know, 2,000 years later, it seems like we still have trouble.
We still have a lot of trouble with it, right? You know, it's like, for all these things we find very glorious, and it's like, well, yeah, you know, was that really, you know, is that really what it's about, right? You know, and yeah, so, you know, it's hard to this day. Wow. Narrow the path and hard the road, as Jesus says.
So starting the new year off realizing the path is going to be difficult regardless.
Well, yeah, I mean, I sometimes think, you know, the Christian life is summed up by that statement by Gimli at the end of Return of the King, right? Certainty of death, small chance of success. Well, what are we waiting for? You know, like, you know, and it's like death is certain. You're almost certainly, not almost, you are going to fail. You already failed at it, thankfully, you know. Only thing now left is go out into the world. Yeah. You know.
Well, and I like that because what I've found anyway is that it's not as difficult if you accept that it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
It's almost like your psychology makes it much more difficult.
Right. Right.
Resisting it.
Right. You know.
I think that's how you get the Mother Teresas. And,
right. If you accept that this is hard. And it's hard from the beginning, and
Cool.
Yep.
All right. So we will ease into the difficulty in January of 2025.
Yes, we will. Yes.
And I think we're off next week, right? You have a meeting after church?
Sure. Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay. So in 2 weeks, we'll be back. If you have any questions, we haven't picked a theme yet.
Yep.
So
all right.